Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. I'm recording this video for you even though there's nobody actually in the Zoom class with me because I promised and didn't deliver. There was some work being done in my house yesterday and I couldn't possibly run the class with all that noise. So I apologize. Also apologize for not recording the intro to meditation. As I promised, I'm going to catch up this following week. And for now, I would like us to go into the second presentation. It's on psychology. It's sort of an introduction to psychology in order for us to get to the fourth wave, which is soul work. It's by no means a full introduction. I'm leaving out way more than I'm including. And if you'd like to know more, there are plenty of free online courses such as on Udemy or other sites. And this is just barely an introduction. Okay, that said, let us begin. Here we go. So when you hear psychology, the first thing that will usually come up to mind is Freud and his sexual references, but it's really a lot more than that. And we have a lot of preconceptions. We have a lot of biases and ideas of what psychology is and isn't. Some people believe it's highly intrusive, and if you were ever to go to a psychologist, they would immediately know everything about you by digging into your soul. And while others believe it to be absolutely useless and a waste of time, and we'll see where these preconceptions come from. And I'm leaving out the entire section that would have been in any decent intro to psychology course, which is the brain structure and where different parts of our brain operate different functions. And again, you would have to catch that up if you're interested. Right, so here I collected some memes which show what people really think of psychology. And yeah, there's a lot of rubbish floating out there. And where did it all begin? From time immemorial, people have noticed that sometimes it's the body that gets affected with disease, and sometimes it's the mind. And it used to confuse and baffle people of ancient times. And if a person suffered from psychosis, they were risking being chained up to a tree and left outside, like in the 100 Years of Solitude book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. One of his heroes ended his life being chained to a tree after going psychotic. And that was the practice. In best case scenario, they would invite a shaman. In African tribes, they still do that. In some Palestinian villages in Israel, they still invite the imam to chase away the evil spirits of a person who is suffering from a mental illness. And on occasion, it ends really badly. Just a few months ago, a woman died while during a rite of exorcism here in Israel. So how do we put it all together? Because for thousands of years, people lived without psychology, and probably at least we know at least somebody who would express this view, like we don't need this whole thing. We lived perfectly fine without it. And now the more we dig into it, the more mental illness seems to increase, and the more kids are coming to school with Ritalin, and the more people are diagnosed, whether they're on the spectrum or they suffer from depression and anxiety. Are the numbers really rising? Or maybe thousands of people just went undiagnosed for the entire history and suffered for their entire lives? I don't have an answer to that question. What do you think? Let me know. Okay, so the dawn of psychology as we know it is Freud, and that is called the first wave, the disease model. In the end of the 19th century, people began to realize that mental illness is there, and they began to be curious in it, and they began treating it with various physiotherapy methods. And Professor Charcot with his discoveries, right? Obviously, when we think of mental illness, straight away schizophrenia comes up to mind, and how people tried dealing with it, usually by locking up the affected people. And the first wave indeed focused on disease, right? The mighty three is Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, and Carl Jung, were the first people who brought psychology to our lives. It wasn't Freud alone. The other two were his students. And yeah, when somebody mentions psychology, we immediately envisage Freud's reception room, you know, the famous ottoman where the patient would lie down and start talking, the free flow of thoughts, expressing their thoughts. And by association, the therapist had to fish out symbols from that free association talk and bring it back to the patient, right? And then eventually, after about 20 years of this, person would feel better, right? There were a few problems with the disease model. Psychologists became victimologists and pathologizers, as in they focused on pathology, and they forgot that there were healthy people as well who might have issues and might need help. We see more of that today, obviously. And they really wanted to fix the people as fast as possible to allow them to live in a regular society. And again, they left out all the healthy parts and all the beneficial parts. They focused exclusively on disease. And here we have Freud and psychoanalysis with his picture of ego and superego. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. He pictured it as a huge iceberg where the unconscious part of our psyche, the id, is the massive part, and we're not even aware of it. It's the animalistic drives. It's all of our wants and desires. It's all the things we're suppressing. When a baby is born, they only have the id. And eventually the ego develops and it tries to mediate between the id and the superego, which is our conscious part. Superego is something we develop in the process of growing up. Superego is basically our parents' voices internalized. They tell us to wash our hands, they tell us to behave, they tell us to shut up and not say embarrassing things. That's the superego. And the unconscious is the voice that whispers into our ears, oh, come on, kick him. He deserves to be kicked, right? And the ego has to mediate to allow enough freedom for the unconscious to flow so it's not overly suppressed, and for the superego to control our behavior but not to turn us into a robot. He calls those parts agencies, right? And superego is quite a harsh voice. Today we would call it the inner critic. It's the voice that tells us the worst things we would ever hear about ourselves, and it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant to be run either by the unconscious or by the superego only. That's why our ego, our conscious part, has to constantly mediate while we're making our choices. And it's not so easy because the id is very powerful. So Freud discovered what he called defense mechanisms. Sometimes we could take our desire and modulate it and adapt it in a way that would allow us to express it in our daily lives. For example, I think it's Rashi commentary on the Torah where it says that Esav was born red-headed. He also mentions that David HaMelech was also red-headed. And then the sages go into this whole discussion. If a person has a desire to draw blood in order to avoid becoming a murderer, they need to become either shochet or mohel. And that is a classic example of how the superego could modulate the desires of the ego to serve our good and the society good. Okay, so Freud also wrote about the psychosexual stages of development in children. Yes, we know he focused on sexuality. It was the main thing. But in reality, there were two forces that he focused on: is sexuality and the drive to death and self-destruction. Just that we are not too comfortable talking about death, which we see in our language, but the amount of euphemisms that we use when we talk about death or sex, we're not too comfortable with both, right? Think about all the euphemisms, such as kicking the bucket, pushing up the daisies, and all the things that we're not comfortable about, we will push away out of our conscious mind and replace the words that make us uncomfortable with euphemisms. Anyway, he believed that the most powerful force driving human beings was our sexual desires. And in order for that force to grow and mature, the child has to go through a few stages, right? The oral stage is from birth until about 6 or 8 months, if I'm not mistaken, where the baby breastfeeds and nurses from his mother, and the source of pleasure is around his mouth. And when he grows a bit, that progresses to the anal stage when the baby becomes aware of their toilet needs. See, I'm also using euphemisms because how else we're going to stay polite over here. It's the anal stage. They're focused on that area as a source of pleasure. And then they progress to the phallic stage when they discover their genitals around the age of 6. And then they make these earth-shattering discoveries of wow, I'm a boy, wow, I'm a girl, and they identify with their gender, hopefully. And then there's the latent stage when their sexuality is dormant, it's not developing. That's when boys and girls could be friends quite comfortably. And then there's adult sexuality when we go through puberty. Right? So in Freud's model, in order for us to graduate from one stage to another, we need to resolve the conflict of that stage. For example, in the anal stage, a child could get very upset that the products of their body get flushed down in the toilet. They could get very jealous and possessive, like I'm sure as parents we've all seen it in our babies. And they need to overcome that desire not to become retentive, not to suffer from constipation. They need to learn to share and give. Yes, it's related. And then we hopefully reach our adult sexuality stage in a healthy state of mind if all of those phases were passed correctly. In the phallic stage, there's this famous Oedipus complex where the boy is jealous of his father because he loves his mother so much, and eventually he realizes that he cannot be his mother's husband because she already has his father, and he needs to progress from that stage to, instead of focusing on his mother and wanting to possess her, he needs to focus on the father and identify with him. I'm going to be a man like my father. And then he solves the conflict successfully and he can move on. It's the same with Electra's complex, which we don't talk about so much, but it's the same thing with girls. She needs to stop desiring her father and instead identify with her mother and say, I will be beautiful like my mom, I'll be successful like my mom. And then she can move on to adult sexuality. If a person fails to progress from, in one of these stages, they end up being stuck. And then Freud called these issues neurosis. We develop a neurosis. We continue to try and relive the same stage over and over. And then obviously he suggested you come for psychoanalysis and talk for 20 years, and then hopefully you'll feel better one day when your therapist manages to find in your free associations a reference to the thing that's bothering you. Let's say if you say that you dream, that lots of psychoanalysis focused on dreams. Freud wrote many books. One of them was on dreams. Let's say if you dreamed of streetlights, it must be a concealed reference to a penis, and then you need to process that whole thing. and then you come out with a resolution. That's psychoanalysis. Lots of subsequent psychologists and leaders of their own movements in their own rights criticize psychoanalysis for the excessive focus on all things sexual and all things instinctual. And it's a very, very simple model. We are a lot more complex than just the id, the ego, and the superego, right? And also, who said that the therapist interpretations of our free associations have anything to do with the truth? Who said that the streetlights are indeed a symbol of a penis? He said. I don't know if it's true or not, right? And also the fact that it took more than 20 years for a person to feel better, we don't have that kind of time anymore. In the beginning of 20th century, when life was slow, people rode horses, and you know, we don't have the time for that anymore. And the development of psychology as a science progressed because people were not too happy with psychoanalysis. And here we come to Carl Jung, who we will continue talking about throughout this course because he laid the ground for soul work to exist. Soul work is really the fourth wave of psychology. Carl Jung is still in the first wave. He was a disciple of Freud. He founded analytic psychology. And at some point, he left Freud because he was not too happy with where psychology was progressing. He developed the concepts of being an extrovert and an introvert. We use these words probably daily, and we don't think too much about it. It's one of these bits of psychology that everybody knows. He developed the archetypes, which we'll also talk about loads, and one of the later webinars will be dedicated to archetype therapy, which we can work with on our own. And he also developed the idea of the collective unconscious. And yeah, he left Freud because they didn't get along anymore, because Jung disagreed on the basis for all mental illness being sexual. And when he left Freud, he continued to develop his own theories, and the collective unconscious is pretty much assumed by everyone now. He also wrote loads about myths and dreams and all the mystical things. He was very much into all things that we don't see immediately. He wanted to delve deeper than just the unconscious. Okay. It's easiest to explain the archetypes by illustrating them, by finding them in the art. And films and music and literature, everything that we read, hear, encounter in any way whatsoever is absolutely chock full of archetypes. And once you start seeing them, you can never unsee it, right? If you think of all the books that you've read as a child, there will usually be a hero figure who goes on a hero's journey that has to do either with winning the female or by winning some kind of a prize. There will be usually an old man whom he will consult in order to achieve his goals, right? The archetypes are defined as universal primal symbols and images that derive from the collective unconscious. They're the psychic counterpart of instinct. Instinct is in the body, archetypes are in the mind. And we continue replaying and recreating archetypes throughout our lives. And for us as religious Jews, a lot of archetypes will come from the Tanakh, and they're slightly different from the regular archetype. For example, we have less of a mother figure in Tanakh than in history and in culture overall. And some archetypes are entirely missing from Judaism, which is okay. I think we can live with that. Okay, so there's the hero archetype. It's Odyssey, it's the hero's journey. And it's the Beowulf, Middle Ages, the first book that's recognized as modern English. Don't worry, you can't read it. It's too confusing. It's still closer to Middle English than to our English. Harry Potter is the classic hero. D'Artagnan and Three Musketeers, Anakin in Star Wars, and Luke. Frodo from The Lord of the Rings. There's the hero's journey, right? They have to overcome all kinds of difficulties, find themselves mainly on the way while they're depositing the ring or destroying the empire. They're really finding themselves. Here's a quote that really resonated with me. The doors to the world of the wild self are few but precious. If you have a deep scar, that is a door. If you have an old story, that is a door. If you love the sky and the water so much you almost cannot bear it, that is a door. If you yearn for a deeper life, a full life, a sane life, that is a door. Okay, so anything in our personality, in ourselves, is a hint. Meaning, if you observe yourself, much as a therapist would, here you're going to be your own therapist and observe yourself. What am I drawn to? Which archetypes do I resonate with? What rings the bell for me? Right? Who am I? Am I being Anakin? Am I being D'Artagnan? Or am I acting in the mother archetype right now? Okay, there's the wild woman archetype. Here's a link. You can read more about it. I'm going to post all the presentations in our group later. There's the teacher or sage archetype. Yoda, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Gandalf. You know, that's whom the hero comes to for instructions. And yeah, the more you see them, the more you will see them. That's the story really with archetypes. See, is a classic picture of a mother caring for her baby. Yeah, it's really big in Christianity and much less so in Judaism. Okay, second wave of psychology, behaviorism. From now on, human beings are not all about sex. It's a lot more general over here. A lot more is included. Well, in the first wave, it was exclusively the drive for sex and death. Here, we're including the entirety of human behavior. And we have to name Skinner as the founder of behaviorism. And obviously, it's all based on experiments of Ivan Pavlov, who, he took dogs, he cut a hole into their stomachs to see how much stomach juices are being released. He measured their saliva. Every time he gave dogs some food, a bell would ring and the dog would salivate. And eventually, the dog would start salivating just from the sound of the bell, which it would learn to associate with food. It was not just the food, the association became the bell, meaning the dog was conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell. The same experiment was done with mice, with lights switching on and off. Each time they pressed the button, they got rewarded, so they pressed the button more and more, and then they learned to associate the button with the food. Meaning, there is a behavior, you want to reinforce it, so you're going to give the creature or human being food or love or caring, and then the desired behavior will grow and the undesired behavior will be reduced. For example, this is used as an example of conditioning in humans. You see an ad of, let's say, beer that you really like, and you start craving beer just from seeing it. You haven't seen beer, you've seen whatever symbolizes beer for you in this advertisement, right? And then suddenly you crave your beer, for example. So it's all very nice, very simple, and it's been extensively used in education and in other areas. And Skinner believed that with the right amount of rewards and punishment, you can condition anyone into anything. I don't know if that's true. You can let me know what you think. Okay, so conditioning has been used, but it's also been used for really bad things, such as being used by dictators and regimes that we would rather not mention over here. And it's been used in the workplace. Come on, you work harder, you get salary rise. It's all about behaviorism, right? And once it started interfering with free choice, a lot of people began criticizing Skinner because, oh, come on, we're not mice in a lab. We are a lot more complex than that. Chomsky was one of the main critiques of Skinner's work. And yeah, you can read about it. Here are some works that criticized him. Skinner also rejected free will, and a lot of people found that really disturbing, because if everything, the sum total of what you do, is just all about conditioning, then there's no difference between us and animals. And people found that intolerable. In our own minds, we would like to think of ourselves as a lot more than animals. And of human spirit being a little bit more than, the saliva dripping at the sound of a bell. A lot of people found this humiliating and rejected it. He was a brilliant writer, 21 books, 180 articles. A lot of it is still being read and quoted today because behaviorism is still in use, mainly in education, of course. Okay, the third wave, humanistic psychology. Now, instead of including just the sex drive or just the behavior, psychology is trying to include more of a person in their theories. And this started not from psychologists per se, it started from existentialism as a philosophy. From Kierkegaard, Sartre, and only then it progressed to humanistic psychology, to Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. So, according to Sartre, every human being is responsible for working out his identity and his life's meaning through the interaction between himself and his surroundings. No one else can do it for him, least of all God. That's Sartre. He was an atheist. Okay, so not everything that he said will be applicable here. Meaning each person is unique, separate, and independent, and they need to work out who they are. Okay, you cannot argue with the responsibility for our own lives, but the atheism was deeply disturbing. They denied God outright, and a lot of people couldn't deal with that very well. What about people who cannot find their identity and their life's meaning on their own? If you do not search or cannot find your life's meaning, you end up with this horrific anxiety called existential anxiety. If you don't know who you are, you don't know where your place is in this life, you will suffer from extreme anxiety. It's been a major therapeutic concern for many leading psychologists, and then we'll talk about it in the next few slides. Yeah. Next. Humanistic psychology was the first movement that added a holistic dimension to psychology. We're not just this. They're not taking a piece of being human and presenting it as the whole human. They believe that our behavior is a lot more than operant conditioning. It's determined by our perception of the world. It's determined by the meaning that we attribute to things that we see around ourselves. We're not simply the product of our environment and biochemistry. Obviously, behaviorism talked about hormones and neurotransmitters and other chemicals that determine our behavior, but they don't talk about the person acting with those neurotransmitters and hormones. And we don't always act on our hormones. Sometimes we can stop ourselves. So a human being is a lot more than just behavior and biochemistry, right? We are driven by the need to fulfill our potential. Humanistic psychology started talking for the first time about what being human means, right? And the drive towards self-actualization, becoming our best selves, achieving the most we can achieve in this life, expressing our own capabilities, expressing our creativity, bringing a change into the world. Who am I and what am I doing is the central question of humanistic psychology. And a lot of this happened after World War II, when the world was still horrified by what happened there, horrified by the Holocaust, and people started asking questions. And they saw more and more the limitations of the disease model of human psyche, and they started talking a lot more about actualization. So here are the 5 basic principles of humanistic psychology, which Soulwork uses as well. Human beings, as human, supersede the sum of their parts. We are more than just our behavior, our hormones, our neurotransmitters, our sex drive, our self-destruction drive. There's a lot more there, right? We cannot be reduced to components. We're not just this plus that. There's a wholeness, a wholesomeness to a human being. And we exist in the human context, right? And we exist in as human beings in this world. It's a lot more than just achieving all the pleasures we could possibly achieve, and then there's nothing, right? Human beings are aware and are aware of being aware, meaning we have a consciousness. As we said in the previous webinar, we don't know how that consciousness arises in the brain. We're now in 21st century, and we still do not know how the neurons and the electric impulses create consciousness and where it resides. Human consciousness always includes an awareness of oneself in the context of other people. A cow doesn't think, oh, I'm a cow. How could I be the best cow ever? How could I be the best cow that I can be? It's a human trait. And the next postulate is that human beings have the ability to make choices and therefore have responsibility. We always have a choice. Even if our only choice is the choice of our thoughts, we still have a choice. Think about that for a second. It was a very harsh thing to realize, but we always have a choice. Even if it's just some switch in our minds, that's still a choice. And therefore, we have responsibility. Responsibility for our lives is a consequence of having the freedom of a human being. Human beings are intentional. They aim at goals. They're aware that they can cause future events. They seek meaning, value, and creativity. All of us always seek to express ourselves through something. Okay, to do a good job, to be creative. Even if you look at a person and think there's absolutely nothing creative there, there is. Just have to find it. And yeah, all these postulates created the foundation for positive psychology and the 4th wave, which we'll discuss next time. Okay, and the last thing for today, the 3rd wave, Gestalt. Gestalt was another reaction to psychoanalysis and the limitations of the disease model. It was a logical extension of the movement towards personal direction and freedom. We'll talk about logotherapy and all that in the next webinar. People usually place just Gestalt later on the timeline than when it really happened. It really started before World War II, but it became more popular after. Gestalt is a German word which means the general picture, right? Again, the sum total is a lot greater than the sum of its parts. The general picture of a human being, of our lives, of our souls, is a lot more than the individual pieces and problems that we may have. The principles of the 3rd wave are like this. Similarity. We tend to group similar items together. Our mind tends to create associations. Okay, continuation. The law of continuity holds. The points are connected by straight or curving lines are seen in a way that follows the smoothest path. Closure. If something is missing in an otherwise complete figure, we will tend to add it. We like things picture perfect. We like things complete, and we'll work on completing it, even if it's just in our minds. Proximity. The law of proximity suggests that objects near each other tend to be viewed as a group in our minds. And figure ground, we seem to have an innate tendency to perceive one aspect of an event as the figure or foreground, and the other as the ground or background. This is about perception. Okay, Max Wertheimer, we'll talk about him probably next time. Here's Carl Rogers. He's also regarded as a psychologist from the third wave. He spoke about self-actualization. He believed that people have the need to grow and achieve their potential, to actualize ourselves. Lots of others also spoke about this, by the way. He believed in unconditional positive regard in therapy, as in when you come for therapy, you don't come to have your problems analyzed and then to be sent back. We're coming to be accepted unconditionally. And if we're going to be self-therapying over here, means we have to give this positive regard to ourselves just as we would to any other person. Meaning, the therapist accepts the client as they are and allows them to express both positive and negative feelings without judgment or reproach. We can do that for ourselves. Okay? Stop telling yourself, oh, stop feeling that. No, I am feeling A, B, C, D right now. Okay, it doesn't mean I need to act on it, but to accept our feelings is step one to being healthy. To identify that feeling, to give it a name, and to accept, okay, that's what I'm feeling right now. He also spoke about the formation of a healthy self-concept. And that is something we continue doing throughout lives. We do not finish growing up when we are grown up. We continue working ourselves and developing until our 80s, or at least we can do that. People with a stable sense of self tend to have greater confidence and cope more effectively with life's challenges. We can give that to ourselves, and we can continue growing up. This is something people often don't realize. We continue to grow up throughout life. Parenting that we received, it was an extremely important thing, but it's not be all and end all. We can always reparent ourselves, fix our parents' mistakes without throwing it on them. Okay, this is now my process with myself. I'm an adult. I'm reparenting myself, and I'm working on developing a healthy self-concept. Okay, I'm continuing to grow up throughout life. Okay, congruence. Our brain will try to preserve that at any cost. Okay, if something comes to us that contradicts our sense of self or contradicts our picture of the world, it will be ignored. It will be deleted from perception because it's too painful to face something that shatters our foundations. So the psyche will simply get rid of it. Okay. He also spoke about the concept of an ideal self. Who do we want to be? Who could we be? Right? And it doesn't always match, but we can continue working on it. If our self-image doesn't match our ideal self, we can work on it. We're in a state of incongruence, and it's very painful. It causes tremendous suffering. But we can work on it and bring our self closer to the ideal self. Rogers believed that by receiving unconditional positive regard and pursuing self-actualization, people can come close to reaching a state of congruence. Meaning, when we feel that we do not measure up to whom we want to be, the solution is not to whip ourselves through the inner critic. The solution is to try to bring our real self closer to the ideal self with unconditional positive regard, meaning self-love, self-acceptance, radical self-acceptance. Yes, I've done all these things. Acceptance. Yes, it was me. Without acceptance, we cannot move on. We cannot heal or fix anything in ourselves. If we're fighting and not accepting, no progress could be made. Okay, he also defined what it means to be a fully functioning person, meaning to be completely congruent, no gap between our ideal self and our perceived or real self. And yeah, what does it mean to be a fully functioning person in our most congruent state? A flexible self-concept. If somebody comes to me and says, oh, but you are this and that, I will not shatter. I will stop, perceive, work on it, think about it, and make something of it, but I will not shatter. I will be able to bend and not break. Openness to experience. Our past trauma is not stopping us from experiencing new things, from discovering new things. The ability to live in harmony with others and unconditional regard for the self, accepting ourselves unconditionally. This is who I am right now, good or bad. This is what there is. Acceptance. Without acceptance, no change is possible. And acceptance doesn't mean I fold my arms and say, okay, so I killed somebody, I'll continue loving myself. No, it's not like that. This is what makes it so hard for people to accept themselves. It doesn't mean complacency. It doesn't mean stopping to work. On the contrary, work becomes possible only after we accept ourselves with all of our quirks and all of our weird parts. Okay, and I'm going to stop at this point because it's been quite a lot of information. I'll upload this lecture. Let me know what was interesting, what was difficult, what was not clear. I will work on it. And also our group is meant for questions, discussions. I would love to see it becoming a little bit more active. Let me know what you think. I'm waiting for some feedback. See you.